is there anything you want to ask me basically before we get going?
No, I don't think so. I'll let you start. If I have any questions, I'll just I'll ask as they come up.
Okay, you've had a reading before.
Had one, yeah.
Was that recently?
Yeah, so it was I want to say it was in December, so last month.
Okay.
And yeah, it was about an hour. And she gave me a little booklet, to take away with significant dates and things I should be looking out for or whatever.
Did she get into any of the theory behind astrology? Was there any kind of
not really.
Because I mean, so your intellect as a Virgo, you're going to seek answers and explanations. It's going to be harder for you to connect with the metaphysical. It's going to be easier for you to understand more of a practical explanation as a segue into the metaphysical.
Okay.
Right. And it's just like there are some people that just have faith and just kind of trust and believe. Then there's other people that kind of want proof and evidence and information.
Yeah.
So your intellect would generally gravitate towards proof, evidence, information. And so oftentimes when you get into discussions with somebody, if they're just moving into a deeper kind of spiritual understanding, depending on where their mind is oriented, it can be quite helpful to bring them a little bit more of the theory behind what's happening so that they can start to frame a little bit more of the human experience. There's nothing wrong with saying you're going to feel this or this is going to happen on these different dates based on the energy that you may experience. But as an introspective journey to really understand the greater workings and what's really at play can be, in my opinion, wonderfully beneficial to really understanding a little bit more of what it is that astrology is trying to educate you on more broadly before you get into kind of the specifics around predictions and intimate details, if you will.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does.
Yeah. And so I'll just give you a little bit of a framework to it, and you can ask questions. We'll let the conversation kind of unfold organically, and then we'll do everything we can. I usually move at a fairly quick pace.
Yeah.
Well, because part of me is always kind of eager to bring a lot of content to these discussions. But if whatever pace you're comfortable with, if you want more detail on something, then by all means, just slow me down. We can dig into it more.
Okay.
So from a very high level, and this is a lot of my belief structure based on my own journey and my studies in this space, but we have to think about the mind, body, and spirit or in Christianity, it's the Holy Trinity, but it's this concept that there's really three primary elements that define us as a being, right? And so we spend most of our time worrying about the physical self. Am I eating well enough? Am I aging too quickly? Will I get sick if I do this? Or how do I recover from illness? There's always a focus on the physical being. And then, of course, we spend a lot of time in our emotional, mental mind, which is why am I sad, or what brings me joy and happiness? What is it that I want to do with my life, right? And sometimes that goes into overdrive, where we get caught up in a bit of the monkey mind, which is, am I good enough? Is this really fulfilling for me? Why do I put up with this?
Yeah.
When we elevate our consciousness and we start to think beyond it, we start to ask bigger questions like, why are we here? Like, what's our purpose? Is there an answer beyond just this life? Did I really just come here to hang out for 80 years and, live the way I'm living and then just disappear as if nothing ever happened, right? More kind of the existentialist mentality. Or you can go very deeply into the spiritual mentality, which is that your soul, which is the third part of your being, is on an eternal journey, and that the soul has actually just embodied your physical form, taken on your human mind with a very explicit intent for this incarnation. Okay?
Yeah.
And that intent can be, usually it's driven through struggles and suffering, because that's what forces us into that space of growth and learning, but it doesn't always have to be. But as we start to reorient our existence more in the context of what our spiritual purpose is, and less around what our human desires seem to bring us to, we start to create a different balance or framework by which we can start to gauge whether our life is truly fulfilling and whether we're moving in the direction or the path that's more broadly intended for our life. All right?
Okay.
All right. And so when you start to pull it together, and it's funny because over 100 years ago, Freud and Jung were dabbling. Of course, they got into their classic, their psychotherapy, but they were spending quite a bit of time trying to understand the different layers of the human mind. And they actually stumbled into classic astrology. And Freud famously came up with the id, ego, and superego as ways of trying to understand how we interact with the world, saying basically there's a subconscious mind, which he didn't, he tried to get into some of your childhood experiences and try to explain it. But at the end of the day, there's a mystery around where our intuition and our impulses and some of our thoughts really come from. And then there's the logical mind, which is, the you that defines your interaction with friends and family on an everyday basis, kind of known as the ego. And then there is also the projection of self, which is kind of the way you see yourself and how you want to project yourself out into the world. And all that they were doing was playing on the three primary placements in a classic astrology chart, which would be the moon, the sun, and your rising sign. And so when we go down this journey and we try to understand who we are and what our spirit is trying to intend for and what energy it brought into this physical body, one of the easiest, most beneficial starting points is to say, what filter or what energy influences my subconscious? What energy influences my conscious mind? And then how do I project myself out into the world? And how do people even experience me? That may not even be clear to me because it may be different from who I truly am. Mm-hmm. And you see that oftentimes in relationships where a couple comes together and they have a quick connection and they get to know each other, and within a few weeks or thereafter, something happens and the energy starts to shift. And what started out as a seemingly good connection has now gone offline. Sometimes you see it even in marriages. Couples come together, especially when they're young, and they're kind of keeping up a facade. They're trying to be somebody that they feel that their partner is expecting them to be. And then eventually they drop into the true self and it just becomes too difficult. Mm-hmm. And so in your case, you have your rising, which is the first impression energy. You have it sitting in Aries, actually, right?
Okay.
And so this is if we can trust the birth time of your chart.
Yep.
All right. So from a spiritual standpoint, you brought through energy that would have projected Aryan energy. So it's more masculine, it's more determined, it's more structured. It's got a strong certain presence, and it can go after what it wants. It's a first impression energy. But the true self is sitting in Virgo. And so with the Aryan energy, you have a couple placements that are sitting along that horizon line that might influence it a bit, make it a little bit less bold, if you will. But the Aries energy is going to easily connect with female fire signs, mm-hmm. right, which would be other Aries, Sagittarians, or Leos. And it would also attract quite a bit of air signs. But when your relationships start to take hold, because the true you is sitting in an earth sign, which is Virgo,
yeah,
and your subconscious mind is actually sitting in Pisces, which is actually quite sensitive.
Huh.
And so now you go through three different elements or three different modalities of self. The first impression, strong, masculine, determined. The true self, more sacrificial, much more nitpicky, more detail-oriented, more cautious, more risk-averse, more conscientious. And then the subconscious or the emotional self, quite emotional, quite sensitive, quite vulnerable.
Is that common?
No,
is it common to have like an energy in one in one?
So you happen to be across the spectrum. You have three of the four elements being represented. Mathematically, it's less common, but it certainly happens. I have it too. I just don't have quite a dramatic variation between the three. So like, for example, some of the other signs can be in different elements, but they're more similar. Like they say the Libra is like a baby Capricorn because the Libra is just a gentler version of the Capricorn. My conscious mind is in Capricorn. My subconscious is in Libra. Mm. And so they can be more harmonized. In your case, they can certainly be harmonized, but you're going to have to work harder to harmonize them.
Right.
And if you get into a relationship that provokes you or makes you feel off balance, you're going to see yourself moving through these variations, which can be, if you don't understand exactly what the soul's intention was and the energy that was brought into this life, it can take a long time to really get a handle on it. And by nature of being, in a romantic space, certainly it would cause conflict by virtue of your energy shifting and then the person that you're with having to deal with variations in your energy while their energy may be shifting also.
Right. Yeah.
And so if you were drawn to them because of their rising sign, which is the projection of them. But then after weeks or months, they dropped into a different energy and they were drawn to you for a projection of self, and you dropped into a different energy. It's a bit of a luck of the draw that your energies of true self end up becoming harmonized.
Yeah.
Right? But when you have this awareness and you understand the energy that's brought into this life, now you have a leg up to get a sense of how people are receiving you, but truly who you're going to be when you settle into a comfortable connection.
So for me, what is that? What is my energy of the true self?
It's the true self in your case. So it's a worker's energy, by the way. There's a very strong work ethic. There's a degree of your schedule. It's the maintenance of your daily grind. Actually, is kind of it's the worker bee configuration, but it's dropping into the Virgo energy, and the Virgo is they call it the Virgin of the zodiac, but the Virgo is it's an earth sign, so it's grounded, it's stable, it's responsible, it gravitates towards integrity and practicality. It's going to be risk adverse. It's going to be great with numbers. It's going to put a particular focus and attention on the details of everyday life. The Virgo's a fixer. It's going to see flaws easily, and it's going to, from a heartfelt space, look to correct injustices and flaws. That's the conscious self. It's not the energy that you give off when you first meet somebody. The energy that you give off is going to be a little bit more bold. It's going to be a little bit more kind of adventurous, if you will. The true you is going to be more conservative.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then where it gets a little bit trickier is the subconscious you, right? Which is the undercurrent, that it is the lens or the filter that all energy and thoughts are running through before they matriculate up into the conscious mind. The subconscious you is sitting in Pisces. So it's going to be a little bit more dreamy. It's going to be a little bit more mystical. It's going to have a lot of creative energy. It can have oftentimes thoughts, feelings, and ideas that come from out of absolutely nowhere that compel you. It also is going to find itself quite vulnerable if you get triggered or go into a state of surprise, like if a relationship is failing or you're in conflict, it drops you into that Piscean energy. It actually would provoke a deep vulnerability in you that might get you stuck in an emotional state that could be very hard to shift out of. Right? So the Pisces, you think about it metaphorically, it's the fish, and the fish starts swimming, and sometimes it can just swim in circles all day and not realize that it's swimming in circles. And if we wanted to layer another element to it, your Piscean energy is the governor of your 12th house. With your moon sitting in the 12th house, it speaks to an early childhood that would have had either an emotionally or literally absent mother. So there would have been an emotional disconnect from the mother, which would have carried forth an added layer of challenge for you to connect with your healthy feminine by virtue of not having a consistent, healthy, feminine, domestic environment to grow up in. And
Interesting.
So your soul would have wanted to bring forth another element of challenge or adversity. It actually has Saturn sitting just below it in the 12th house, which means that there would have been events, chaos, conflict in the household, and you as a child wouldn't have felt that you had any control to influence those outcomes. It wouldn't have been the structure and the consistency that you as a child would have needed to really develop healthily. This would have created an element of adversity by which your whole life would actually be tainted by, and your subsequent relationships, career choices, interpersonal decisions would all be then vulnerable to these events that would have started very early on in your childhood. And that would have been the intention of this incarnation, as driven by the spiritual energy that carried it into this life, to give you an opportunity to overcome this adversity and to extend into something greater than the limitations as depicted here from the beginning. All right.
Wow. So I guess I have a question with like the timing, right? So, okay, so my soul, you're saying there's a reason for me being in this space and in this time and in this body. Is that somewhat accurate?
It is. You chose to be here.
Right. so I chose to be here for a certain reason. Maybe there's a purpose for that. But then I'm also hearing from you that while I'm here, there were some challenges in my childhood that now, how is it?
The
Is that
soul,
related to my purpose, or is that?
yeah. So your soul, ultimately, your soul is actually, depending on what theory you subscribe to, and the one that resonates most deeply with me is we're actually this physical realm that we find ourselves in. It's just an inflection point. It sets up a trajectory that our soul will move down for a long time to come. And the trajectory is basically saying, am I in service to self or am I in service to others? And the way that your soul is going to be pressed to a point where it's choosing service to self or service to others is through suffering, mostly emotional-based suffering. And so the soul says, I'm going to choose an incarnation that is going to come complete with a degree of struggle or suffering. It's going to manifest in different ways. And we're going to allow the soul, the human and metaphysical mind to move through that suffering and ultimately choose what kind of life it wants to live and what direction it's most called to. Is it called towards, because you see it all the time when somebody is suffering, they either grow more compassionate and aim to alleviate the suffering of others, right? They're like, geez, I've gone through that too, let me help you. Or they become more selfish and they say, you know, I'm suffering so badly, I need to take from others.
Yeah.
And so this inflection point, which is just it's a moment in time, you're going to incarnate many times over to keep replaying it until your soul eventually makes that strong decision that will set up a long period of your future incarnations, either in the company of others that have chosen service to others or in the company of other souls that have chosen service to self.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the bigger metaphysical framework. I could spend days talking to you about it because I spent years studying it. But if you look at it from a very high level, we get stuck in the weeds because one day to the next, it's like, you know, we got to go to work, we got to pay our bills, we got to deal with whatever it is that's pressing in our mind. But if you look at it more holistically over the course of a lifetime, as people get older, you can see they either become these curmudgeon-y kind of closed off, more bitter individuals who are just either disgruntled by life, or they're just looking to exploit others because they feel they've been wronged. Or you get these really gentle, kind of magnanimous, generous types who continue as they go along to be more and more in service and try to help as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And that's more broadly, metaphysically, what it is that your soul's trying to accomplish. It knew that if it could bring in certain amounts of struggle for you, it would create enough variations in your emotional well-being and your relationship space and the awareness of self to force you on a regular basis throughout an 80-year incarnation to constantly make decisions. Is it about me or am I in a position to help others?
Yeah, that's really interesting because so I waver between that, you know, between ending up being the curmudgeon or ending up being this very empathic person. Now, if you know, it's funny because I talk to people who, you know, are very, you know, simplistic in the way that they look at others, and they're, you know, they basically classify people as givers or takers. And
it's a good way it's a simplistic way of seeing it.
Yeah, in that classification, I'm clearly a giver. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like I always, like, so my first impression of myself is the giver. You know, so being this empathic person, but yet when I kind of dig deep a little bit, I don't know, right? I don't know, because so my last reading, basically, she said that, you know, I'm here to serve, right? So like you know, that's kind of like, you know, my motivation for things. I serve, but I get to a point where I serve so much and I suffer so much that I tend to resent, right? And then so I switch over from, now going back to what you said, so basically I am this giver and I am this empathic person, but then I get to a point where it's like, hey, now I need some sort of self-love. And then I kind of switch off between being that, you know, that empathic person into being more of a selfish person. And I think that doesn't last very long, but I do sense that I kind of get to that point. in my life at sometimes. And actually it's somewhat of it's almost like a relief a little bit, because I am like not being the one that's always providing and always kind of being there for other people.
Yeah.
So that gives me, when I get to that point where it's like, oh, I've been suffering so much, like I don't really care about anyone else anymore, I just want to care about myself. That gives me like a bit of relief for, a little, for whatever hours or days or whatnot. And then that kind of just dissipates, and then I'm back to like, okay, let me let me help you as best as I can, or let me put your needs ahead of mine. Let me give you what you need.
So and let me ask you, what do you feel you're getting relief from?
From the just from the demands of being the person that always gets stuff done. So if it's in a work environment, it's the person that always gets stuff done, the person that takes responsibility for stuff and makes sure things get done and things get done well. And on a personal level, it's relief from, being the, I guess that's not it's not exactly right, but the breadwinner, I will say, right? So being, being a break from being the one that's like, in charge and in control and the leader, and being kind of like, the follower or the one being taken care of, as opposed to being the one that takes care of everyone else.
Yeah. So who would you say is putting those demands or expectations on you?
Oh, I am. Yeah, that's part of my DNA. I think that I, especially in a family environment, and even in a friendship relationship, like I always want to be the one that gives more than takes. Right. So like, yeah, like what I want to eat doesn't really matter. Like you decide what you want to eat, and I'll just figure out like whatever you like. I'll just figure out something that I could kind of tolerate with respect to that, in a simple sort of example. Yeah, it's a lot like my mother was. It's just like, it's kind of altruism, but to like, to a degree that maybe isn't like the healthiest, right? So yeah, so it's putting my own needs aside and trying to meet the needs of, the external source, whether it's the boss, the client, the lover, the wife, the child. But then I think that gets me in trouble, because instead of trying to match, my needs with those other needs, I put my needs aside and focus on the other person's needs. Until I get to the point, it's like, hey, well, what about me? Like, so I'm saying this internally to myself. Hey, what about yourself? And then I'm like, yeah, I haven't gotten anything out of this relationship or this work, or this contract or whatever. And then I start to make demands and ultimatums, right? And
Yeah.
I'm feeling that right now in like the 3 clients that I'm working on. So it's like, look, I've been working my ass off for you guys and getting everything done and doing stuff that you guys wouldn't have known how to handle. Yes, you could have gotten somebody else that would have known how to handle it. I'm not saying I'm one of a kind. I'm one of many, but I haven't been compensated for that. And now either you compensate me, or else I'm just gonna, I think we should part ways, right? And in a friendly way. Like I'm not going there angry, even though it kind of sounds angry, but yeah, so I get to this point where I'm there, I get to that point, and I'm at that point, like, it seems like I'm at that point with like a lot of my clients right now.
Sure.
And yeah, so that's kind of like my struggle, right? So it's, yeah, it's like, and I think this is maybe the fact that there was a lot of conflict in my family growing up. There was always like a side to pick, right? It wasn't like everybody could be happy, right? It was always like, well, if this person's happy, then that person's not happy. So that's kind of like happens to me internally, right? So it's either like, well, let me make the other person happy and they'll be happy, and then I can kind of find happiness that way. But yeah, I think I need to kind of figure out how to how to not sides, right? How to have like a win-win situation.
Do you want to do that? You want to work on that?
I
Because
probably should, right? I mean,
might as well. I can tell you energetically what's influencing your conscious mind. I can tell you what's coming through and give
yeah,
you a little bit more of a reframe about it.
yeah,
So,
sure.
so the environment that you referenced as a child would have only just been a set of examples. It didn't necessarily dictate this existence. It's really just we may fall back on it as a story or some type of explanation just because the human mind requires an explanation.
Right.
But there are plenty of kids that grow up in, conflict oriented households that don't feel like I grew up in a conflict oriented household, but my subconscious gravitates towards balance and harmony. Whereas your conscious and subconscious both gravitate to devotion and sacrifice.
Right.
All right. And it's funny because you're super conscious and there's 3 other planets in your chart that are in fire, and that fire energy is actually selfish intention. So there is a little bit of the angel and the devil, if you will, or the yin and the yang, however you want to see it. There is an inner conflict that's inherent within this chart. So the true self and the subconscious self does want to go into devotion and sacrifice, which is the other astrologers spot on. But then there's enough fire energy that's saying at the same time, especially if it feels that it's being taken advantage of, it will get to the point where it'll actually stand up for itself, or it will, because it's fire, could blow it up and it could say, this is over. I'm not going to handle this. I'm not going to take this anymore. That all said, the Virgo, which is the true you, is a naturally vulnerable sign because its comfort zone is in a state of sacrifice. Right? Your most quintessential Virgo is Mother Teresa.
Okay.
Right? And so she was able to dedicate her life towards sacrifice. Where Mother Teresa excelled was that she was able to sacrifice in a way that gave her endless fulfillment by virtue of doing it for these children. Right? You also have a quintessential Virgo in Warren Buffett, right? Who's a relationship-oriented Virgo, but not in a state of self-sacrifice in the traditional sense. He's very charitable and he plans on giving away all of his wealth, but he's maintaining healthy balance as he moves along his journey. All right. And so one of the great challenges for the Virgo inherently is to be in a state of sacrifice, but to do it with a degree of balance that doesn't come at the expense of their own health and emotional mental well-being.
Yeah.
And the way that the Virgo does that traditionally, there's 2 traditional metrics to it. The first, which is a little bit, it takes some practice, but the first is actually to extricate yourself from virtually every relationship and try to see the individuals that you're interacting with and see it through their eyes and their lens. And then do everything you can to select partners, whether it be clients or romantic partners, that are exhibiting a degree of devotion and sacrifice as well, so that you can feel that you're receiving in exchange for your natural tendencies to give, and you can create that dynamic. Right? And so the struggle with the Virgos, they oftentimes gravitate to the takers because they're so inherently oriented around giving. So they feel good to give, but because they gravitate to the takers just keep taking and taking. And then the imbalance gets so severe that it comes at the takers actually do just fine. And it's the Virgo that ends up suffering in that equation.
Yep.
And so that's your challenge, is to actually, before you, as the relationship is unfolding, saying, is this person actually exhibiting generous tendencies? Are they showing an interest in my own well-being as well? And if not an overt interest in my well-being, are they at least showing great appreciation for my sacrifice? Yeah. Right? It's that difference between somebody who feels entitled versus somebody who feels appreciative.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like step number 1, hugely important. The second thing that you can do, and once again, that this is a long journey, and so I wouldn't expect you to get there right away, but if you are bringing more and more spiritual intention into your space, eventually, once again, it still has to come with balance, and, kind of the respect for self, but eventually you'll evolve to a place where you can just give and it won't unbalance you, even if you're in recognition that the people around you are taking. In a business context, you have to obviously communicate healthily to make sure that the financial element, the compensation, is in order. And so that you're articulating exactly how much you're giving, the hours that you're putting in, the sacrifices that you're making, and making sure that you're obviously not being taken advantage of. But in an everyday capacity, your romantic space and your friendships and what have you, you can continue to give, and especially if you get into charitable causes or community service, you can continue to give and continue to give. And at some point, with enough spiritual intention, your consciousness will actually elevate, that you're giving with just the pleasure of giving without actually any expectation or need to receive.
Yeah.
It's a much longer term goal. I struggle to get there myself at times. I've noticed as I've evolved, I've certainly gotten better. I just like to help everybody wherever I can in whatever way I can, but it still carries some limitations. And, my own relationship, if I feel unappreciated, it affects me, and I have to communicate that. And so for the Virgo, I'm an earth sign also, but the Virgo is going to take it even further. And so those two big tips, which is the awareness of the relationships that you're getting into and the ability to see them clearly for who they are without expectations of change. The Virgo is always looking to tweak and to change, and they hold out hope that people can actually, especially with your Pisces moon, you're trying to see the best in people oftentimes, and it can kind of blind you to the reality. And so you want to recognize that they're on their journey and accept them where they are, but then choose whether or not you want to be vulnerable to where they are and the energy that they're bringing forth.
Yep.
Okay. So that's kind of the discussion. And keep in mind that when you have these various placements combined with the struggles in the childhood, it may not have been because there wasn't an easy example set for you. It doesn't mean obviously that you can't create an easy example, but it also does mean that this is kind of reinforcing that same general theme, that this was all intended as part of your own journey and your struggle, that this was all a very deliberate part of this place for you. And to be frank, this is a very generous giving chart. If you continue on this path, my guess is over time, especially if there's not some expectation of financial remuneration, but if you're just in a position to be giving and living through your heart, you can raise consciousness and vibrate at a level that will naturally, especially with a high degree of self-esteem, will naturally attract people to that space for that generosity.
Yep.
And that's kind of the name of the game. That's like the bigger goal.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. And that sounds really spot on. Yeah, I mean, that is something to strive for, right? So I think the second thing that you said, that longer kind of process, is definitely like a thing to strive for. Yeah. Because that would be great, right? Because if I can give and feel that it's not really suffering, but it's, that kind of energizes me, which it does. Obviously, that's why I'm a giver, right? Because giving does energize me. But if it just never gets to a point where I feel as though I'm sacrificing myself, for the other person.
That's it.
That would be nice. That would be a nice place to be. And I think that's a really interesting goal to shoot, to strive for.
It's the goal.
Yeah.
It's the goal because if when the majority of your time and energy is spent in service to others, which is giving for the sake of giving, supporting and helping for the sake of supporting and helping, when the majority of your time is in that space and it's not destroying you in the process, that actually is the indication that you've completed the incarnations in this density, in this realm. That's how the soul knows that it's ready for what comes next.
Yep.
Right. And this is the concept. The universe operates in polarities, right? For there's only darkness because we know of light. There's only cold because we know of heat, right? There's only the concept of down because we know that we can move up, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is a series of polarities. In the construct of a soul's journey, the polarity, as I mentioned, is service to others and service to self. If it's service to others, once you're in a majority.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's my cat. Sorry.
The cat's drawn to the conversation.
Yeah.
Once you're in a majority of service to others, that means that your soul has now completed the intention of this realm. The opposite, which is the other polarity, is actually what they would say is 95% service to self. So most of us operate, if we think about a spectrum of true charity versus true selfishness, right? Like Mother Teresa being true charity as an example, and maybe I don't know, the current American president. I don't know, or maybe like, you know, some of the eviler characters over the years, you know, Genghis Khan or somebody extreme who is in service to self. Most of us are going to exist at different points on that spectrum. We don't actually have to get up to Mother Teresa. We simply have to have a majority of our time and energy being spent towards others to complete, because then you're in perfect balance. It's just a 51%, if you will, in service to others. The opposite of that from a polarity standpoint would be 95%. So almost entirely, it's because it's what's known as entropy. You get to an extreme state of service to self. And when it's an extreme state of service to self, you've also completed the density, this incarnation, but you're going on a very different trajectory from those that are service to others. And so the Bible allegorically referred to this as heaven and hell, right? But it's only because they wanted to create a construct that the human mind could latch onto. All that it's really saying is that depending on the polarity that you've chosen, you're going to be with others that have chosen that polarity. And if it's service to self, the lessons that you're going to learn are only going to be in the company of others who have chosen service to self. Because if you're service to self, you're exploiting those that are service to others.
Right.
And so those that are service to others are in support of others that are service to others. Those are in service to self are looking to exploit. And so the lessons that they need to learn are no longer in the company of people who are service to others. They have to learn their lessons strictly in the company of those that are service to self.
To self, yeah.
And that's actually the law of one. I wouldn't recommend it just yet at where you are in your spiritual journey, but there's literature around it that explains exactly how it all unfolds. And so ultimately where you are and what you're describing is that you're actually called to service to others, and then it makes you feel really good, but it has to come with a degree of balance. You have to have limits around it because you don't want to be exploited, right? First and foremost. And then also you have to it's looking into self a little bit more and the expectations that you put on self, whether, you know, you're the breadwinner and you're the responsible one, you're taking care of it all. But those are not external expectations. Those are self-influenced or self-imposed expectations. And so when you do find yourself tired of being in service to others, oftentimes it's really that maybe your own self-criticism or the demands that you've put on yourself have gotten to such a fever pitch by virtue of serving so many other people and taking on all their responsibilities that they're not actually demanding you be better or different, right? That's not what's imposing on you. It's by virtue of having all these responsibilities that you're demanding so much of yourself.
Right.
And that starts to wear you out. And so that's the journey with self, is to understand when you're doing it, to see the limitations that, you know, that ends up putting on your own well-being, and to optimistically come up with spiritual tools, whether it be meditation or as an earth sign, you do really well just grounding yourself in nature, you know, like really just submerging yourself for long stretches without distractions in nature, all as a way of divesting some of that heaviness to bring you back to your center, bring you back to self.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. That's great advice. I mean, it's funny because I have like a to-do list that's like 3,000, you know, items long, and I have like a very important to-do list, and one of them, I think like the second item is, and I think they call it like green therapy now. It's like take walks in nature.
Yeah.
Because, and it was like, you have to do this. Like try, you know, I'm telling myself like, you have to do this, and you're telling it to me. I mean, it's what you're saying. It's really interesting how that, like that, I told myself that, and now you're telling me that. So I guess that means it's really important for me to do.
When you hear it from multiple sources.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, when you're in nature, especially if you take time just to be still, like just to be quiet, like Edgar Casey talks about it, the trees will speak to you. Like you can actually receive wisdom. And there's a higher consciousness that when the mind is settled and quiet and it doesn't have the distractions, which is really what nature is, it gives you so much stimulation, but not a distraction.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can truly be in that space. Then you can actually, if you get good at it, you can start to receive the wisdom and the answers that you may be seeking.
So yeah, this has been very, very interesting. Right. So this whole concept of like your soul, you know, having a purpose and like that, that's all you. Like I didn't hear that before in like my other reading.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not. I studied astrology for a long time, and I love it. But it's
Yep.
just, it's one root of many, right? You think about the tree being grounded, and each of those roots are seeking, they're seeking water, and they're bringing nutrients from the soil. The astrology is just one of those. It's one of those many roots. You still have to understand why the tree is growing, how the tree grows, how it's desiring to be more in the sun and to bring in the energy from the sky, if you will. Like there's so much at play within our human existence. The astrology just gives me a starting point by which I can understand you and your purpose, but without the encapsulation into the theory behind it, it doesn't, to me anyways, it didn't carry a ton of weight. Like it's one thing to say, oh, Virgo is going to do great with a Capricorn, they could be best of friends, and that's wonderful. But the bigger question is, but why? Like, why was a guy born on this day in Morocco able to connect with a guy born on this day in Canada just because of their birthday? Like, how is that possible?
Yeah.
And so as I started to dig deeper and deeper, I got to a point where it just started to all come together in my mind. And as that started to happen, I felt like I was finally in a position to start sharing it with people and to really help them, because with this framework, you start to see your whole life through a different lens.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, your soul is an eternal energy, and I can give you a little bit more of the theory behind it. But if we think about, we have to think about source, we have to think about creator. God oftentimes carries these heavy connotations, and so people resist the word God. But we have to just think about some spiritual energy that was able to create this universe. For source to experience its creation, right? It's impossible if we think about the source metaphorically as being the sun, and the sun is just heat, or we could say it's love. But if we think of it as heat, the sun could never experience what it means to be cold, because the sun is just this mass of just perpetual, incredible heat. And so how does the sun experience what it is to be cold? It has to create an entity that can leave the sun, to go a far enough distance away from it that it no longer feels the heat of itself, right? And so if we think about what coldness is just a lack of heat, right? Just like darkness is just a lack of light. And just like fear is a lack of love, right? Once again, you can just create these constant polarities. So we think about source created the universe and said, okay, I am the universe. I've created it all. How do I experience it? I can't experience it as me. I have to experience it through something separate from me. So he then went and created souls.
Okay.
But he said, but I can't tell you what to do in my universe. I can simply give you free access to it. And then whatever it is that you get up to, whatever you end up doing, I'm going to experience it through you. And then when you're ready, you can come back to me. And how do you come back to source? Well, you have to journey through this amazing universe that's been created in all of its glory to one day actually gain the ability to influence or to likewise create, so that you return to God as a companion. You return to source as an equal after having experienced all that's been created.
Which could take
On average, like 14 billion years. I don't, like your soul to have gotten to this level in your incarnations, because you're now third density. There's just like octaves on a piano. The whole universe works kind of like music. You have the notes, and then you have chords, and then you have symphonies. Like they all keep building on top of each other, right? So you have these different layers. So for your soul to have gotten to this point, you're somewhere probably maybe 3 to 4 billion years along in your incarnation. And so,
are there people further along? Is everybody living this age?
No, the souls are all created, but we're all moving at different paces. We're at different speeds. Like Eva, for example, is quite far along, actually.
Yeah.
In her soul's journey for this incarnation, she's quite far along. Like I speak to people now that come from different points, and they're all at different levels. They're in their journey. We're just at what's known as the third density. We're just at one little sliver, but it's like gradations in a color wheel. Like you have red, and red kind of bleeds, and eventually gets to orange, and then orange starts going through all these different shades and eventually gets to yellow. and then yellow bleeds through and gets to green. So we're all at different points in that yellow, the 7 chakras. We're at different points in that color wheel. And your ability to find a good companion is to find somebody who's actually right at your same level of spiritual progress. Because your level of consciousness and the decisions that you're making are best matched by somebody else who's at a comparable level of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Like I was in Morocco actually for vacation, and I went to the open market in Marrakesh. And, there's the guys playing with the monkeys, and there's the guys with the snake charmers, and there's the people. And I'm like, okay, nobody's really honest. Everybody's kind of taking advantage of you. You're just you're getting cheated everywhere you go. And I kept saying to my girlfriend, I said, well, that's the level of consciousness. That's where they are in their journey.
Mm.
If somebody chooses to incarnate in a very simple part, let's say it's like some small community in southern US or some, Southeast Asia, small little environment where their only responsibilities are just food and shelter, right? That's just where their consciousness has evolved to. That's just what they're ready for. Yeah. Versus somebody who is incarnating into the Northeast or in Northern Europe, who has a lot of academic and career responsibilities, who's also living a very moral, ethical life, who's seeking opportunities to serve others and to bring, greater light and wisdom to those that they encounter, right? That's speaking of a much higher level of consciousness.
Yep.
Right. And eventually you get even entities that have completely graduated from this realm who have chosen to come back to bring greater wisdom and raise consciousness as an act of charity. And so that would be like the Eckhart Tolles or perhaps the Dalai Lama. Yeah. Like, they don't have any value in being here for them, right? But their souls have returned and they went through their spiritual awakening, and they just had an open channel for infinite wisdom based on how far their souls had already advanced that they could then access and communicate it through.
Got it. So I think you answered this. I think you're answering it by what you had just said, but explain to me, the hospital that I was born in Casablanca, Morocco, let's assuming it wasn't a hospital and wasn't in my parents' home. There were other babies born on that very same day, in that very same minute, in that very same place. So why are we not all the same? Like, why am I not identical to this person? And maybe I think it's...
They're all different souls. So right. There's 4 levels that define you, right? There's the nurture nature, the soul, which also often in romantic space is known as chemistry. And then there's also your spiritual evolution or your level of consciousness. Okay, so if you have 2 babies that are born, like identical twins born exactly the same time, they're going to have similar, quote unquote, chemistry. There's going to be energy that's very similar because their souls would have passed through the same levels. But by virtue of the souls being different, they're going to invoke that energy remarkably differently based on where they are in their journey. So oftentimes you see twins that are born and they're just incredibly energetically, they're quite connected. Because the chemistry, the energy is similar. But if the souls are at different points, one of them could go on to live a very different life because one of them could become a monk or some deep spiritualist. The other one could just, have 3 kids before the age of 25 and become a housewife. And it would just speak to the needs of the soul based on what it was that they wanted this incarnation to stand for. So, and to put it another way, so your chart has enough challenge in it. It has enough adversity in it, that if somebody with lower consciousness, they might have succumbed to some of the heaviness of this chart, especially some of the early conflict that they were raised with. And it may have imperiled them from going on to a successful life or to true independence.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas you had consciousness and you were able to invoke the necessary tools and get into the, find the right resources and do enough introspective work to keep yourself on a path that allowed you to continue to move forward, to maximize this journey as needed for your soul's growth. And so that speaks to your level of consciousness. It speaks to the soul itself. So you might have similar energy to the baby that was born right next to you, insofar as they're also a Virgo. They're also, they like to give. They're sacrificial in that regard. They're sensitive to financial matters, right? They're good with the details. Like, they carry that kind of same type of energy. But did they have the courage to move from Morocco? Were they able to overcome the adversity that they encountered, what manifested in the chart, right? And then you get into this knock-on effect where the things that you choose lead to other events, which lead to other events. And it's only with hindsight that you can see how you got to exactly where you are based on all those different choices that you made it what are called inflection points of your life.
Yep.
So like a divorce or a marriage or inflection points, leaving the country where you're born is an inflection point, disease, illness, accidents. Those are all inflection points. Your soul actually had done a preview before it came into this life to anticipate those inflection points. Yeah. And so when you reach those moments, there would have been a familiarity around them because you would have actually already experienced them before incarnating, which is why we have this concept of a deja vu, right? Or some people will meet somebody and they'll be like, wow, there's like this instant chemistry and they just feel so connected. And they don't know how it is or why it is, but two people come together so immediately, sometimes in the most bizarre of circumstances. And that's because both of their souls, separate energies, part of a collective, but operating as separate energies, were able to preview that encounter prior to the incarnation so that when it actually happened, they were able to influence the conscious mind enough to feel as if it was familiar and to call them into that space.
Yeah. All like really, really interesting stuff. Yeah. It's yeah. And I guess we're almost done. Yeah, it's amazing because I wish I could focus just compare you to me, right? So that's your job, right? You have this job where you do this real stuff, right? You tell people
it's real only if you believe it, if you believe it to be real.
But its end result is towards improvement in helping people, right? And helping yourself. So your job is really interwoven with how you want to lead your life and how you as opposed to what I'm doing, where it's okay, I have to do my work, and then when I'm done with my work, okay, now I can kind of nurture myself and whatnot. And I guess as I'm saying that, maybe that's not that's clearly not the right way to do it, right? It's either finding work that's nurturing, like you said, or it's trying to find something in my current work environment that that bringing in that healthy stuff into that work environment.
And actually what I would think, I mean, and I get into these conversations quite often with people actually, and it's a little bit of my own energy that I sometimes impose on them, but I believe that we are here for a reason, like a purpose, and you have a finite amount of time by which you can realize that purpose. This is a particularly dense realm that you've chosen to come to, and it's because your soul wants to grow as quickly as possible. Right? There are other realms that are far gentler, where you just meander a little bit more. But if you've chosen to come to this realm, you have the physical body fails inevitably at some point. The mental, emotional body is always under assault, right? There's a degree of loneliness that seems to pervade almost everybody's life, no matter how active they are. At some point, they look around and they feel as if they're on their own because we feel very individualized here, right? All that creates a degree of suffering, which is all designed to push you forward.
Yeah.
And if we think that we've got 80 years to kind of maximize our time here, then we can start to look at the way we're spending our days and looking at our career. And we can say, okay, do I believe that that's what my soul really wants for this life? Right? Insofar as, are you growing? Are you expanding? Is this the journey that you feel is giving you the greatest fulfillment? And by extension, the ability to serve others. Right? And so if the answer is no, then it's a matter of a little bit of creativity and oftentimes a bit of courage to start saying, well, where does that fulfillment lie?
Yeah.
And it's rarely a matter of, as an earth sign, I never encourage impulsivity. People I'm just going to quit, or I got to just change. It's no, you find the things that you love most and you start to trickle those into your daily life while concurrently managing your practical life, because you always have to keep a roof over your head and you want to be motivated by financial independence, So you take care of that aspect of your life, but slowly you continue to give a little bit more and a little bit more attention to the things that will align you with your true self, right? Which in your case is going to be, it's going to be taking the skills, the talents, the gifts that you have, and finding ways to bring those into a state of service for others, optimistically, without expecting the remuneration, without needing it, but seeing that as if it's to come as a byproduct of following your passion or following your purpose.
Yeah.
And so, and it's a little bit for you to discover, and you probably already know it. You think of the things that give you the most energy, the things that give you the most joy, the things that make you feel the most fulfilled. And then we start to look for some type of practical application of those things, right? That you can do on a regular basis. Like if you had told me a couple of years ago that I was going to be kind of a spiritualist talking about astrology, I would have been like, yeah, it sounds like a bit of a far-fetched idea, you know? But it called to me and it called to me. And so I was doing it for years just for fun. And people were oftentimes would look to compensate me. I continued to do it. I was kind of like you. I got to the point where I got exhausted because I was getting so many requests and I wasn't accepting anything in return. So I had no balance around it. So I had to fine tune the process, but eventually got to the point after doing it for a few years that I just let go of my job altogether. Not because this is an income source that I can sustain myself on, but because I had saved enough money from my other job. And I felt in my heart that I only had 80 years to maximize my time here. And I didn't want to be that 80-year-old man looking back at the 44-year-old me and saying, Allan, why the hell didn't you get out of that job? You were so done with it.
Yeah.
Like you had another calling and it was helping people like crazy. Like, why wouldn't you just have pursued it?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't have an attachment to the material. So I'm not like buying stuff all the time. I don't need to accumulate stuff. I live a relatively modest life. And so the money that I'd saved is enough to sustain me in this kind of more humble, it's not an impoverished existence. It has all my needs met. And so from there, I was just like, well, then just go into a state of service as much as you can, whatever that looks like, whatever your gifts and talents are, bring those to the surface and see how you can share those with others.
That's great.
And so that's like, and there's nothing preventing you from, it doesn't happen overnight. It's conversations, it's thinking it through, it's trial and error, right? It's being really gentle with yourself as you screw it up and you have to redo it. And you feel like it's not working, you have to adjust, right? It's not something we need the inspiration. We don't need the methodology right away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so once the inspiration properly takes hold, then you start to see what it looks like from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, this was really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm glad.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm glad.